No. While thinking about what I can contribute to the discussion, I, first of all, like to mention that the things that we are discussing today have history. And let me begin by emphasizing a historical dimension of the process of what some people call collaboration with Waal. Of course, the expression comes from the experience of studying collaboration of German intellectuals with the Nazi regime. But I like the expression so much, and of course, it can be expanded to other, not necessarily very similar, but somewhat similar situations. I cannot go too far in the history of the Soviet period, but starting from the 1980s, even before Brezhnev's death, I was somehow personally involved in academic exchanges from the authoritarian side with the West. And my first experience of this kind of exchanges was almost a miracle. I don't know until now how I could get there, but I got a scholarship of the French government, a year-long scholarship, in 1982. So I came to Paris. Of course, I was excited about everything. I was then a French historian, and I worked in the 17th century France. And of course, I had then some contacts with my French colleagues. Who were those colleagues? Why they were interested in me, coming from an authoritarian context? The French academic establishment, of course, was split into right wing and left wing. My immediate supervisor was a very right wing person. He was not interested in me at all. He was very polite, very nice. He helped me a lot in my research, but saying that me as a Soviet historian, young Soviet historian, was a kind of object of special interest for him, no, it would be an honesty. But there was a group of historians which was interested in me as in a Soviet historian. And that were people from the left, the Annales school, basically. I followed seminars there in the École de l'Institut with quite left-wing people. And they tried to be very nice with me. And they didn't know, of course, what kind of feelings did I have with regard to the Soviet regime. And I didn't really work hard to make them understand them for obvious reasons. I had to be very cautious. I didn't know who would denounce me, to whom. But I remember, for example, a very telling situation. A seminar of a leading French specialist in the 17th century institution of history, didnt, and someone who perhaps you may know, who was to become in the future a very influential Israeli diplomat and ideologist, Bargnani, who by his training was a French historian. He was discussing something religious was in France and so on, and he was trying to transmit the message that people during the religious wars were not necessarily all believers. And he gave an example. Does Andropov believe in communism? And everybody in the room was really shocked by the example, and they began showing at me, here is someone in the presence of whom perhaps it's a little bit inappropriate to raise questions about the loyalty of Soviet citizens and Soviet leaders to communist ideas. What was that? Of course, it was nice in a way, but it also betrayed a kind of hidden, not very hidden even, sympathies with the Soviet Union, which were there and until now are still typical of a certain and very influential segment of Western academia. And one of my points, basically, I have 2 points here, is linked to this very, very remote experience. One of the main problems that prevents the West from efficiently dealing with authoritarian regimes is that there is a very influential segment of Western opinion which, being motivated by its hatred or lack of sympathy or whatever with regard to the West itself, sympathizes with whomever is against the West. It's not only people from the left. It's mostly far right and far left who sympathize from both extreme points of the political spectrum with Mr. Putin or the like. And once again, it was that in the 1920s and 1930s, and it is with us until now. This is problem number 1. The second problem is also related to my relatively remote personal experiences. In the perestroika period, the same people from the Bargnani school became extremely active, establishing, developing the relationships between the French academia and the Soviet Russian academia. And it happened that since I knew personally many of them from quite some time, I had the possibility to exchange a lot of press on them. I didn't have means of pressing, but to try to convince them that they do not need to deal with the Soviet Russian establishment. These are not the best people who we can get in Russia or other former socialist countries. Why are you interested in getting to the presidium of the Academy of Sciences of Russia? Just don't waste your time. Once again, those friends and my French patrons were very polite listening to me, but never followed my advice. Why? Because there is an influential segment, and this is not the same segment as the one that I mentioned before, of Western academic leaders and politicians and experts and whatever, which, by pragmatism, understand that it's better to have some kind of relationships with those people who are in power in those authoritarian countries. We do not only support, well, to simplify, dissidents. We also support, or at least try to develop relationships, or establish relationships, with those who are not dissidents at all, who represent the regime. So it's another way of, corruption is too strong a word. I would prefer to use it for some very material cases of inappropriate relationships. But if we speak about corruption in a broader sense, in a very broad sense, then it's also kind of corruption. It's too pragmatic, too pragmatically driven. So these two things, on the one hand, sympathies with whomever is against the West, and on the other hand, pragmatic reasoning, or we need to communicate with those in power within. We need to understand them, and some of them, by the way, can turn out to be nice people. So let's do business as usual. These two things intervene with any kind of systematic politics by Western, more liberal, more democratically minded, more idealistically minded people and institutions aimed at somehow, at least from the beginning, at purifying the West itself from that corruption. Now, these were my two main points that I wanted to make. how I'm doing on time?
You have 4 minutes.
4 minutes, good. So I have still a couple of, or maybe even 3 more points that I wanted also to mention now. First of all, let me remind you a story which has, of course, little in common in terms of scale with the contributions of Russian oligarchs to Western institutions. Stephen Cohen created fellowships, his name, which theoretically were offered to those who wanted to do research on the Soviet Union. And that created, in this association, a scandal. There were people who were saying, no, I'm not dealing any longer with this association if it accepts Cohen's contribution. And of course, the association has accepted it finally. And I think the association was right, because no matter how strongly I disagree with Cohen in academic terms, no matter how reasonable or suspicious that he may have more closer relationship with the Kremlin that we all know about, but still he is a distinguished academic. He was a great historian. He is a great historian. I give his works to my students, and usually reading them, discussing them, provokes very good discussions. But still, the problem of where the money comes from is not only the problem that it comes from the Kremlin, not only petrodollars. It can come from other sources within this country as well, which can also be problematic. My second minor point is Turkey. Turkey. Not just the bird that we are all going to eat in a few days, but just the country of Turkey that we will not be able to eat, to swallow. Turkey is tremendously active in promoting and using very similar kind of means. At a smaller scale, of course, they don't have as much money as the Kremlin has, but still using the money, quite important money. They also have contributed massively to the establishment of Turkish studies centers all across the United States and in other places as well. Now, I used to work a little bit, it's not my field, but I happen to work a little bit with the literature on the so-called neo-Ottomanism, or the ideology which is very much promoted now by the current Turkish regime. And this is kind of ideology of the rebuilding of the Turkish Empire. Now, at least 70% of what I could read on the topic and what came from those Turkish studies centers in the United States was very much pro-neo-Ottomanist. The logic was, listen, it was of course a period of the Cold War when everything was just organized around the two ideologies, when we forgot our roots. And now we are discovering that we were so diverse that we can cherish, there are things that we can cherish, in our heritage. It's a very positive story. It's kind of neo-Ottomanism, which is an ideology of Turkish neo-imperialism, is presented as completely innocent stuff by American scholars, some of them of Turkish origins, but not only. And we can guess what kind of motivation is there. It's not necessarily that they paid for that. It's simply that leftist thinkers manifest themselves in the conditions of their institutions getting some support from those people who would like to justify neo-Ottomanism, right? So these things very often come together. And the fact that Russia and Turkey are very similar in many respects politically also is reflected in the ways in which they try, in the similarities between the ways in which they try to influence Western opinion and create positive images of their past for themselves and for the entire world. Well, I guess I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you.